What really makes us happy? Myths and truths about dopamine. Imagine this. You pick up your phone to check the time, and 30 minutes later, you find yourself scrolling through Instagram. Sound familiar? What if I told you that every like, every notification, every tap isn't just a habit, but part of a carefully engineered system designed to exploit one of your brain's most powerful mechanisms? But here's the catch. Everything most people think they know about dopamine, the so-called happiness hormone, turns out to be a major misconception. Dopamine doesn't make you happy. In fact, it's not even a hormone. What actually happens in your brain when you get that much anticipated notification? Why does the first slice of pizza never taste as amazing as you expect? And most importantly, how can you stop being a hostage to your own biochemistry and start using real knowledge about dopamine to live better? Today, we're going to bust some of the most widespread myths of the past several decades and uncover the real science of what makes us happy. We're living through a dopamine revolution. Every day you hear about dopamine detoxes, dopamine addiction, and the happiness hormone. The internet is filled with advice on how to raise your dopamine to feel happier. But what if the whole industry is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how your brain works? First, understand that dopamine is not just a chemical. It is a complex communication system between neurons that defines how we learn, what motivates us, and how we make decisions. Seeing dopamine for what it really is can radically change how you approach happiness, productivity, and life itself. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll take a fascinating journey through neuroscience. First, we'll destroy the myth that dopamine is simply a pleasure hormone. Then, I'll explain how dopamine actually works in your brain. And trust me, it's far more interesting than just more dopamine, more happiness. Next, we'll tackle the most dangerous misconceptions about dopamine that could be harming your well-being. Then, we'll look at what actually makes us happy, according to modern science. Finally, I'll give you a practical system for managing dopamine, based on the real mechanics of how your brain works. By the end of this video, you'll understand why chasing dopamine highs is a dead end, and how to use true science to create sustainable well-being. Part 1. The Great Pleasure Hormone Myth. Let's begin with a story that may change how you see dopamine forever. Picture a laboratory in the mid-20th century. Scientists implant electrodes into a rat's brain, targeting a dopamine-rich area. The rat learns it can press a lever for electrical stimulation to that zone. What happens? The animal starts pressing the lever like crazy, up to 7,000 times per hour. It forgets food, sleep, everything. Researchers conclude, we've found the brain's pleasure center. Dopamine is the happiness hormone. There was only one problem. This interpretation was completely wrong. Here's the truth, and it's far more fascinating. Dopamine isn't the pleasure hormone. It's the molecule of anticipation, learning, and motivation. When you're expecting something good, dopamine rises. But when you get what you want, dopamine drops. A simple example. Imagine going to a new restaurant that's gotten rave reviews. On the way there, dopamine is firing. You're anticipating pleasure. But as soon as you take your first bite, dopamine drops. If the food is better than expected, a quick spike. If it's worse, a sharp fall. Key point. Dopamine acts as a signaling system. It tells your brain, pay attention. Something important is happening. It's not about happiness chemistry, it's the chemistry of learning. That's why social media so easily grabs our attention. Each time you open an app, your brain doesn't know if there will be good news, a cool post, a surprise. That uncertainty is the main trigger for dopamine. But here's a paradox. The more dopamine hits you get, the less satisfying they become. Your brain adapts, so you need more and more stimulation to achieve the same effect. Now you can see why more dopamine equals more happiness simply doesn't work. Dopamine isn't fuel for happiness. It acts as a compass, showing you what to focus on and where to direct your effort. Next, let's look at how this amazing system actually works in your brain. Part 2. How dopamine really works. One of neuroscience's biggest discoveries in recent years is that dopamine doesn't work like a chemical shower, dousing your entire brain. Instead, it's a precise messaging system. Think of dopamine as a courier service in the vast city that is your brain. In the past, scientists thought dopamine worked like radio ads broadcast to everyone simultaneously. But recent studies show dopamine operates like targeted delivery. Each message goes to a specific recipient. How does it work? When you see something interesting, say a beautiful sunset, certain neurons get a dopamine package. Remember this, it's important. But nearby neurons may not get any signal at all. Here's the key, the dopamine system works with lightning speed. The difference in processing good and bad events is measured in hundredths of a second. Your brain decides what to pay attention to long before you're conscious anything's happened. Even more interesting is dopamine's dual nature. There are fast local signals, like messages between close neighbors. And there are slow, broad effects that alter the general brain state, like the difference between a quick text and a mailed letter. For example, imagine you're learning a new language and you finally understand a tricky phrase. A rapid dopamine signal locks in the new neural connection. You remember the phrase's meaning. At the same time, a slower dopamine effect boosts your overall motivation to keep learning. So generic advice like, raise your dopamine doesn't work. Dopamine isn't fuel that you can simply top off. It's a sophisticated communication system that needs to be understood in context. Dopamine is contextual. The same action can trigger completely different dopamine responses depending on circumstances. Chocolate after a hard day versus chocolate while you're dieting trigger the system in wildly different ways. And it's not just about pleasure. Dopamine fires for all significant events, good or bad. Escape a hazard, your brain learns, next time, be careful here. Dopamine at work. This complexity explains why most common advice about dopamine is either useless or harmful. Next, we'll break down the most dangerous myths that can undermine your well-being. Part 3. Top dopamine myths that harm your health. Now, let's expose the most important and sometimes dangerous myths. Myth number 1. More dopamine equals more happiness. It's like saying more salt equals tastier food. Sounds logical, but in reality leads to disaster. If someone always chases dopamine hits, shopping, likes, quick pleasures, their brain adapts, needing more and more stimulation. That's a direct path to addictive behavior. Truth? Happiness is not about dopamine quantity, but quality and context. Dopamine from achieving a tough goal is totally different from dopamine from an impulse purchase. Myth number 2, dopamine addiction. This phrase is everywhere. People talk about dopamine addiction to phones, games, social media. But here's the problem. Dopamine doesn't cause addiction. That's like blaming the mailman for delivering bad news. Addiction is a complex behavioral disorder involving many neurotransmitters in brain regions. Dopamine plays a role, but not the central one. If you say I'm addicted to my phone because of dopamine, you oversimplify the problem and blind yourself to real solutions. Myth number 3. Dopamine detox works. This myth is especially harmful. People avoid all pleasures, music, socializing, tasty food, imagining they're resetting their dopamine system. But dopamine isn't a toxin to be purged. It's a vital neurotransmitter, always at work. Restricting all dopamine sources can lead to depression, apathy, lost motivation. Would you try detoxing from oxygen? That's how absurd dopamine detoxes are. Myth number 4, dopamine is only about pleasure. This myth ignores dopamine's main function, learning. Dopamine helps you remember what's important, form useful habits, adapt to new situations. Focusing only on pleasure misses the system's potential for personal growth. Key point: these myths don't just mislead, they actively prevent solutions to real problems. Someone who believes in dopamine addiction may ignore the true causes of their behavior. Someone practicing dopamine detox might strip away crucial sources of motivation and learning. The reality: the challenge isn't dopamine itself, but how we use technology and structure our lives. Dopamine is a tool, and like any tool, can be used in positive or negative ways. So what does genuinely make us happy? Part 4. What really makes us happy? If dopamine isn't the source of happiness, what is? Science says, true happiness is much more interesting than a simple chemical equation. Happiness isn't a one-time event. It's a stable condition, more like physical fitness than a fleeting good mood. You can't get fit in a day, but regular practice sustains it. The first real source of happiness is social connection. Our brains evolved in social groups, and healthy relationships are the strongest predictor of wellness. Dopamine is involved, but it doesn't act as pleasure hormone. It's about learning social skills. Time spent with loved ones teaches your brain, this matters, let's do it again. Dopamine locks in social patterns that support survival and flourishing. Second source, effortful activity. Paradoxically, real satisfaction comes from challenge, not easy pleasure. The brain rewards effort and overcoming obstacles. Compare a Netflix binge to finishing a tough project. A show gives instant but shallow pleasure. Completing a project is harder but brings lasting fulfillment. Dopamine is part of both but works very differently. Third source, physical activity and nature. We're designed for movement. Exercise triggers a cascade of biochemistry that supports well-being. Dopamine motivates us to keep active. Even a simple walk raises dopamine slowly and sustainably, unlike the quick jolt from social media. Fourth source, creativity and learning. When you create or master something new, your brain literally rewires, with dopamine playing a central role. What all these sources have in common is they require time and effort. They aren't quick dopamine hits, but enduring patterns that support long-term well-being. Let's move on to how to use this understanding practically. Part 5. Practical dopamine management. How can you use knowledge about dopamine to improve your life? Forget dopamine detoxes and the chase for instant gratification. Here's a system based on how dopamine really works. Principle 1. Earned rewards. Treat dopamine like your inner accountant. More effort equals more satisfaction. Cook your own meal instead of ordering takeout. The preparation triggers anticipation dopamine. The result brings reward dopamine, and it tastes better because you invested effort. Principle 2. The dopamine menu. Create a structured list of activities in 4 categories. Quick and easy, a walk, call with a friend, good coffee. Medium, reading, cooking, hobbies. Challenging, mastering a skill, sports, creative projects. Social, time with loved ones, helping others, group activities. Not everything should be hard. Balance is key, but try to avoid activities that provide instant pleasure with no effort. Principle 3, expectation management. Dopamine reacts to the gap between expectation and reality. Expect too much, and you'll likely be disappointed. Practical trick: lower your expectations just before doing something enjoyable. This isn't pessimism, it's optimizing dopamine. If reality exceeds expectations, you get a bonus. Principle 4, dopamine fasting. Not a pseudoscientific detox. It's simply a temporary restriction on easy dopamine sources before important tasks, for instance, putting away your phone to focus on work. This works because the brain will seek dopamine from what's available. If the only option is your project, your brain switches to it. Principle 5, learning cycles. Use dopamine to form lasting habits. Start small, 10 minutes of reading daily, for example. Dopamine will reinforce the pattern. Gradually increase difficulty and mark your progress. Keep a simple log. What builds anticipation? What brings real satisfaction? What gives a quick thrill but leaves you empty after? This helps you understand your own dopamine system. Now you know how dopamine really works and how to apply the science. Conclusion: we've journeyed from myth to reality. Dopamine isn't a happiness hormone. It's a sophisticated learning and motivation system. It's not your enemy. It's not a drug to be cleansed from your life. It's a tool you can use wisely. Key takeaway: true happiness doesn't come from chasing dopamine spikes, but from building stable behavior patterns that support long-term well-being. Quality relationships, challenging activities, movement, and creativity, these are the real sources of satisfaction. Dopamine is involved in all of these, not as a source of pleasure, but as a teacher, helping your brain recognize what matters. Here's a practical challenge. Pick one activity from your dopamine menu that requires effort but brings fulfillment. Maybe a morning run, reading, learning a new language, or calling a friend. Try doing it tomorrow before you check your phone. That's the start of healthy dopamine management. Not fighting it, but understanding it and working together. If this video changed your perspective on the brain, leave a like. Subscribe to Think Clearly for more science, without myths or pseudoscience. And remember, real happiness isn't just chemistry, it's a conscious choice about how you spend your time and attention. See you in the next video, where we'll talk about how the brain makes decisions and why willpower is a myth too.